Congresswoman, thank you. It is so good to see you. You know, Lynn Woolsey, you don't know half or a quarter or an eighth of what she did for America and for this community. You really are wonderful. Thank you. And I had forgotten about that comment about, you remind me of Karl Marx. Do you know who I think said that? I think it was Rick Santorum. It was, wasn't it? He was on the committee. Anyway. But it was right after the Gingrich crowd came in. It was a really remarkable change. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I am especially delighted to be here for the West Marin Community Services. And Socorro and Wendy, thank you for everything that you are doing. Are you still here? I can't see you. There you are. And I also want to sing the praises, if I may, of two wonderful people who have done so much for this community. Kate and Steve, well, really, you guys have given new meaning to the idea of community independent booksellers, bookstores, because what you do is not just sell books. You really are the anchor of this community in so many important ways. And I'm sure that I speak for everybody here when I thank you for what you have done, and what you're doing and what you will do in the future. So thank you again. Well, I've just returned from 4 weeks of something called a book tour. As you can see, it's worn me down. I was 6'1" when I started, and there is somebody here who has sacrificed almost as much as I have on the past 4 weeks, and that is my darling, wonderful wife, Perian. Please. She is so private, she won't stand up. The name of the book, by the way, and you will have, this is sort of part of the book tour, isn't it? Yeah, the name of the book, and we will be selling the book, and I'll be signing your books, is called Saving Capitalism for the Many, Not the Few. And I just spent about 3 of those 4 weeks on the book tour. I was in red states, in red cities, so-called. I asked the publisher, I said, specifically, I really would like to go to places that are red cities, red states, because I want to talk to people about these issues. And I did. And it was a very interesting experience. First of all, they didn't like the title of my book at all. They said, it sounds like you're criticizing capitalism. I mean, saving capitalism sounds like it needs to be saved. And interestingly, I got back here a few days ago, and everybody on the West Coast says, we don't like the title of your book. Who wants to save capitalism? So, it's a perfect title. It just antagonizes everybody. But the subtitle is actually much more important. That is, for the many, not the few. And I think that what we heard, that moving story from Socorro about that family really can be multiplied, we know, even in our community, which is one of the wealthiest and also one of the bluest in America, because there are so many people who are not making it, and also there are so many people in what we used to call the working class or even the middle class who are under extraordinary stress. I was debating an economist not too long ago who said we should not worry about inequality in America. If we were worried about anything, we should just worry about the poor. Just focus on poverty. Just focus on the poor and don't worry about inequality. Well, the problem with that attitude and that assumption is that you can't really deal just with the poor in isolation. If the middle class is shrinking as it is, There are fewer places for the poor to move into, to ascend into, because by definition, the middle class is smaller. And secondly, you have an even more diabolical problem, and that is, and we can see it, and I saw it around America, when the middle class is under greater and greater stress, there is less generosity. They're more susceptible to demagogues who use the politics of resentment to point the finger of blame at people. Now, you were all here. You had a choice tonight. You could have stayed home and watched Donald Trump. You know, he's emceeing Saturday Night Live tonight. You knew that. If you wanted to leave right now, I mean, everybody will notice who you are, but you did have a choice, and I appreciate that. I will come back to Donald Trump. But let me just say that there is a great deal of stress out there, and I know it, you can tell it. Well, you don't have to look at the polls, you just look at your neighbors, and maybe some of you are feeling the same kind of stresses. I have a kind of free-floating focus group that I didn't even intend to have one, but I go through airports, and because I'm kind of conspicuous, people come up to me who I don't know, and they start a conversation as if we've been in a conversation. And not too long ago, I was in Portland, Oregon, and in the airport, somebody came up to me. I had no idea who this person was, and she said, "So what are we going to do?" Now put yourself in my position. I mean, I have no idea. I said, "I don't know." About 3 weeks ago on this book tour, I think it was St. Louis, somebody came up to an airport and said, and again, this is a complete stranger, "Can you believe it?" I said, "What?" But there are so many instances where people are, and what they're really saying, most people in this country do not differentiate sharply in their minds between the economy and politics. I mean, it's all just one big system, and they're correct, actually. It is one system, and people are very alienated from that system. Now, I wrote this book because I was getting more and more exasperated over a conversation that I found myself in over and over again, and that is I would basically be debating somebody who was or called themselves a conservative Republican about whatever. It didn't matter what the topic of the debate was. It could be climate change. It could be middle-class wages. It could be beekeeping in Austria. It doesn't matter what it was. And within about 4 minutes, the conversation would sort of degenerate, and I don't know quite how it would happen, into a question of, do you trust the government or do you trust the market? And I found myself on the side of saying, well, of course we need to have a government, and then my debate partner would be defending the so-called free market. And it seemed to me that there was something inherently wrong with that debate. It framed the choice in a way that didn't make any sense. Because you can't have a market without government. Government sets the rules of the market. There is not a market in the state of nature. I mean, there is a kind of survival of the fittest, the biggest wins. I mean, I remember when I was in kindergarten, the playground was sort of survival of the fittest. I wanted civilization. I needed civilization. And civilization is about rules. And the rules are even the most elemental issues. What is property? What is a legitimate contract? What is bankruptcy? What are the rules with regard to excessive market power? We could go through the list, but the point is that unless you have those rules, you can't have a market. And the real issue is who has the most influence in making those rules. Who is the market for? Who is government for? And therein lies, I think, the most important story that is not being told. That's why I tried in the book to tell it. Because over the last 35 years, those rules have shifted dramatically. The rules that define the market have shifted in the direction of the people who will benefit most. Now, you all know that the median wage since the late 1970s has stagnated, adjusted for inflation, even though the U.S. economy is about twice as large as it was in 1980. And when you just do the arithmetic, you see that there is a sort of a weird and, well, a kind of a troubling question. If the median wage hasn't grown and the economy is twice as large, where did all the money go? And when I ask that question publicly, as I tried in red state after red state and red city after red city, there was a sort of a kind of awkwardness, because people didn't overtly accuse me of being, well, actually, on a couple of occasions they did, a class warrior. And I explained that I'm not a class warrior. I have nothing against people who are making a lot of money. That's perfectly fine. They are part of a system. It's not that they're wrong or bad. The question is how that system is organized. I'm not a class warrior. I'm a class worrier. You see, there's a difference. It's a subtle difference. And I worry about the sustainability of a political and economic system where almost all the gains are going to the top. And one reason I worry is just a very simple, pragmatic worry, and that is that if the vast middle class and the poor don't have enough money to buy all the goods and services the economy is capable of producing, then the economy itself is not going to function very well. I mean, when you think about it, one reason that this recovery has been such this has not been a very dynamic recovery. It's been 6 years, and we're not even back to where we were before the economy fell off a cliff. This has been a very slow recovery. And one of the reasons it's been so anemic is because the middle class and the poor just don't have enough purchasing power. But there is a larger problem here, and it has to do with politics. Because when you have so much income and wealth going to the top, inevitably, regardless of how pleasant and nice and responsible the people are who are basically raking in most of the gains from the economy, inevitably that kind of economic power translates into political power. Even if we didn't have Citizens United, which I think is one of the 3 worst Supreme Court cases in history. I'd put it up there with Dred Scott and Bush against Gore. But even if we didn't have Citizens United, we would still see, as we've seen historically, when you have extraordinary money and wealth at the top, invariably it affects and distorts the political process. And what I tried to document and argue and make the case around in the book is that the distortion creates a vicious cycle, because the more power economically you have at the top, the more the rules of the game get rigged in favor of the people at the top, which gives them even more wealth and more power to rig the rules of the game. It's the cumulative effect of all of this, compounded over time, that is so insidious. Amen. Yes. Well, it's a huge and growing problem. It breeds cynicism about everything. The stresses that people feel, not only if they are poor and middle class and working class, translates into a lot of anger. And in the book, I tried to talk about what kind of anger we see and what politics we inevitably face. Now, what I said in the book, I wrote the book before Bernie Sanders declared, before Donald Trump declared, before we saw the kind of rise of, and the best word I know is populism in America. But what I predicted was that in future years, if we are going on the same trajectory economically and politically, in future years, the big choice that voters will make will be less and less about Democrats versus Republicans or even liberals versus conservatives, and more about anti-establishment versus establishment. And that there really are two different kinds of anti-establishment populist traditions in America. One is reform populism. That's the kind of populism we had beginning with William Jennings Bryan in 1896 that transformed itself eventually into the progressive era that started in 1901 to 1916. In fact, in many respects, if you and I, all of us were here and it was 1900, we would see a country that was characterized by many of the same features we see today. Huge inequalities, huge corruption. The robber barons had lackeys who literally delivered sacks of cash onto the desks of pliant legislators, extraordinary poverty and urban squalor and rural squalor, and a lot of people who basically thought the system was inevitably doomed. And then 1 year later, that populism that was welling up, that William Jennings Bryan prairie populism and other sources of very much grassroots populism, found expression in Teddy Roosevelt. Nobody expected the Republicans. He's the last person Republicans expected would become president, but he became president almost, well, really accidentally. And then Teddy Roosevelt ushered in. He didn't lead the charge. He actually enabled, allowed the progressive era to begin. It was already there. It was already bubbling up. Robert La Follette fighting Bob La Follette in Wisconsin. On this book tour, I was out in Wisconsin, and people, they don't know what hit them. I mean, there's still a very strong progressive tradition in Wisconsin, but they also feel like an army of occupation has taken over, not the Occupy movement. But there is a second tradition in America of populism. It is not reform populism of the Robert La Follette fighting Bob La Follette, or William Jennings Bryan, or even Teddy Roosevelt tradition. It is something different. It's not a dominant tradition in America. Some of you may either remember, you probably don't remember literally, but you remember hearing about Father Charles Coughlin in the 1930s. One of the first radio Nazis, quite seriously. Or in the 1950s, Joseph McCarthy. Again, not a Nazi, but sort of a representative of authoritarian populism. He used the anger that a lot of people felt and channeled it toward scapegoats that really were objects of hate and fear. That's what authoritarian populists do. And so when you look at what has happened to American politics, if you had asked me a year ago, who will be the nominees for the Democratic and Republican Party, I would have said, well, it's very easy. It's the establishment. It's Hillary Clinton and it's Jeb Bush. Well, something happened on the way to the first primary. I don't know on the Democratic side. The polls are now showing that Hillary Clinton is surging ahead, but Bernie Sanders certainly has a lot of force behind him. He is the legacy. He embodies the legacy of reform populism, a kind of a spirit of fundamental reform of the democratic process, getting big money out of politics, making it possible to have rules, once again, that make the economy fair, fundamentally fair. And then we have at least one Republican candidate who represents the other tradition. He's the candidate you're not seeing tonight on Saturday Night Live. But it's a serious threat. And I mean that. I don't want to pick on him, and I don't want to appear too partisan tonight, but it is the flip side of reform populism. And even if in 2016 there is not somebody elected, even if Bernie Sanders is not elected, even if Donald Trump is not elected, and I almost feel embarrassed using the two in the same sentence because they are so different. And I hope if you're following my logic, you understand the profound difference between the two of them. But even if populism doesn't surface in 2016, it is not going away. The discontent, the anxiety, the worry, the frustration, the anger that motivates it, either in a positive direction or in a negative direction, is building. It will manifest itself somehow. It is already beginning to manifest itself at the state level. Now, what do we do about it? Well, here I want to talk a little bit, and I want to turn it over to you and your questions, and I want to hear your questions. I want to talk about bubbles, because we are all in a bubble. We here in the bluest precinct of the bluest county of the bluest state in America. You know, some of you may remember I did share with you this story at another point in time, but 10 years ago, I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is another blue city in a blue state, in a blue area of this country. And I got a job at Berkeley, and I was so excited, and I got in my little Mini Cooper convertible, one of the first Mini Coopers available of this line. And I drove across the country and got to Berkeley. I love driving across America. I don't know how many of you have had the privilege. It's a wonderful experience. And you drive through the Midwest, and you drive through the Great Plains, and you drive. I had a map with me that showed every Starbucks in America. And when you actually, it's interesting because the Starbucks are in these little oases, these little liberal oases. They're little blue islands. And they're Starbucks, and then you can have a Starbucks wherever you are, and you can talk to people in your own language. And then I came all the way to Berkeley, and I discovered that I was still in exactly the same bubble that I was in Cambridge. It was the same bubble. There were 3,000 miles between them, but really they were part of the same little blue bubble. And one of the problems when you're in a bubble is that you never have a chance to test your ideas. You know, the only way, I tell my students at Berkeley, the only way to learn something is to talk with people who disagree with you, because that forces you to test your ideas and also enables them to test theirs, and maybe some learning can go on. And all of us are in these bubbles. We can't really learn anything. I was in a gas line in Oklahoma, and I was sitting in my little Mini Cooper, and just waiting for gas, and these big truckers came over to me, and they tapped on my window, and I lowered the window, and I said, "Can I help you?" And they said, "What is this car?" I said, this is a Mini Cooper." And they said, "How does anybody fit in there?" Well, I got out and I stood up and I said, no problem at all. And they looked befuddled. And I said, you see, I'm from Massachusetts. We're all under 5 feet tall. But here's a discovery. When I was out in Red America just now, over the last few weeks, there was a remarkable amount of overlap, agreement about certain things. Now, not on the cultural or social issues, but on many of the economic issues. For example, when I would talk about the takeover of the American economy, a lot of people, I mean, most of the people I was talking with who described themselves as conservatives or conservative Republicans or even Tea Partiers, they were nodding their head in agreement. And we got into some Q&As, and they were all talking about how do we stop crony capitalism? How do we stop crony capitalism? What do you mean by crony capitalism, I asked. And they said, well, it's when these big corporations and Wall Street, all the money that they put into politics, they get special favors. And I said, you mean like corporate welfare? And they said, yes, exactly, corporate welfare. We've got to put a stop to corporate welfare. And I thought, wait a minute, am I in red America now, or am I in blue America? And then we continued to have these kinds of conversations. They said, why is it, one of my questioners, in fact, I had this every Kansas City and St. Louis and Cincinnati and every place I went, how do you justify CEOs earning now 300 times the average worker's salary when in the 1960s they were getting 20 times the average worker? And I would say, I don't try to justify it. In fact, I'm from Berkeley. I'm from California. I take this on. And why are you upset about it? And they would explain to me how unfair it all seemed. And then I'd ask them about things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They were all opposed. I would ask them, how many of you are opposed? Almost every hand would go up. I said, are you conservative Republicans? Yes. Do you get what I'm saying? Again, an anti-establishment populism is rampant in America. We call them conservative Republicans, and again, for purposes of social issues and cultural issues, they are very different from many of the people in this room, but when it comes to some of these issues of power, and we really are talking about power, economic and political power, they sound remarkably similar. In the middle of Missouri, I met with a bunch of small farmers, Republicans. They called themselves Republicans, but they were meeting together, and I asked permission to come and talk to them. They were meeting because they were so angry about what they called the factory farms, the big corporations that were coming in, taking over the farms, and were treating the cattle and the land badly, creating environmental damage, and also squeezing their margins until they had absolutely nothing. Big food processors that were monopolizing the food chain, big agriculture. In Cincinnati, I met with small business people and some bankers, again, calling themselves Republicans. Their big concern was the bailout of Wall Street and how powerful the Wall Street banks are. And now they even know something that I put in the book that I didn't think, and many people knew, that in terms of total banking assets in the United States, in the year 2000, the 5 biggest banks on Wall Street had 25% of all banking assets. Today, they've got 45%. The too big to fail is a much bigger problem now than it was before the crash of 2008. These people knew it. They were small bankers. They wanted to be protected. They felt that it was wrong to deregulate Wall Street. They said to me, how could Bill Clinton have got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act? You were in the Clinton administration. How do you justify that? And I couldn't justify it. I said I wasn't there then. But isn't it interesting? So I want to, and there's so much more to talk about, but I don't want to give away the plot, for one thing. And for another, I want to end by just saying that I am an optimist. Now, why am I an optimist? I'm an optimist, number one, because historically, over and over again, in the 1830s, again between 1901 and 1916, in the 1930s, to some extent, some of you remember in the 1960s, we put capitalism back on track. We, the American people, we rolled up our sleeves, we put ideology aside, and we did what needed to be done to reform the system. We have not succumbed as other countries have in times of economic stress. We have not succumbed to totalitarianism, to fascism. We basically are reformers. We've done it before. Every 40, 50, 60 years we do it. We're going to do it again. I'm also an optimist because I surround myself most days, when I'm not flogging a book, with young people between the ages of 18 and 25. And it is impossible to be pessimistic when you're surrounding yourself with young people between the ages of 18 and 25. I can tell you that I have been teaching for 35 years, and there is no generation I have ever taught that is more idealistic and public service oriented than today's 18 to 25-year-olds. And the third reason I'm optimistic is that I don't like the alternative. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you, West Marin Community Services, a good exemplar of what I am talking about. Thank you for all of your activism. You wouldn't be here tonight, I don't think, unless you actually took politics seriously. And you know, as well as I do, that being a citizen is not just a matter of voting and serving on juries and paying your taxes. Citizenship is about being an activist. And thank you for your activism. Thank you.